Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun. We use the laws of maths to understand how that happened. You and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of evolution.
It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
so when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have. This reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis,
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection, or a standard that you're aiming for, to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you. So you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either.
Evil does exist, as much as that may be a problem for why a loving God would allow evil. Nonetheless, it's a signpost that something beyond the material world has to exist to allow this realm of good and evil to exist.
In fact, I think Alex recognizes that signpost, because on his website, he rails, I think rightfully, against some of the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, where he talks about how priests have sexually abused children, and obviously that's a great wrong. But my question is, Alex, if you really think that is a great wrong, why would you deny objective morality? I mean, is that really wrong, or is it just a matter of personal opinion?
Well, I think that we agree in one sense that evil doesn't necessarily disprove God. I'm with you on that. What I would say is to answer your question, objectively, no. It is a subjective thing. Morality, to me, is entirely subjective.
Why do you say that?
Well, because, firstly, a thing to note is that objective morality... Well, let's talk about what objective actually means, I suppose. Objectivity, to me, if you want my definition, would be to say that it is true regardless of human intervention, regardless of human consciousness. For instance, the Earth orbits the Sun. That would be true if all humans disappeared.
Right.
Every single one of them. It would still be an objective fact. But to say that murder is wrong, if every human disappeared, that couldn't still be wrong, surely. That would be a nonsense concept without some kind of human psychology. The only way that you could argue that perhaps it would still be wrong is if there was some kind of transcendent being. But then you need to have that being in order to prove the existence of the objective morality that you're then using to prove the God. So
but what we're doing is we're reasoning from effect to cause, that we have this effect known as this moral law that is pressing on us. And as you admitted in the video, and look, videos, 2-minute videos, 10-minute videos, you can't expound on all the nuances. So if this is wrong, correct me. But you seem to say that in fact, I think you quoted, the quote was, let me just quote you accurately on this, because in the video you said this. You said moral truths are so deeply ingrained in us that they feel like they are objective.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so... my question is, why would you doubt they're objective if they're so deeply ingrained in us?
Well, because this is where I think Sam Harris is right, in the sense that if you have certain assumptions, so let's say that we could assume that human well-being was a good thing. We'll discuss why shortly, but let's say we assume that. We could then say that it is objectively true that we should act in certain ways, for instance, trying not to murder people. And that would then become an objective morality. Right. So because evolution has instilled within us, through genetics, a drive to stay alive, then we can derive objective moral truths about how we should act in order that complies with this inner nature, which I think has come about through evolution. So even if you don't subscribe to the idea that certain moral actions, such as not killing or not stealing, have come about through evolution, the instinctual nature within us to stay alive causes us to think of those as objective truths. But it's a technicality. So for all intents and purposes, you could say they're objective truths. If you grab 100 people off the street and ask them, is rape wrong? 100 of them will say yes. But that doesn't mean it's objective. I mean, for instance, I put it to you, would you say that chocolate is tasty?
Yeah, I would, but that's a subjective.
Right, sure.
Some people may not like chocolate.
It's subjective.
Yeah.
So
that's
tar,
a flavor.
So tar can be just as tasty as chocolate. But that's no problem, right? That's no problem whatsoever. So when you say something along the lines of, so morality is subjective. So what Hitler did being wrong was just an opinion. Well, yes, but in the same sense that chocolate tasting as good as tar is an opinion.
I think when
it doesn't make a difference.
Alex is right to say morality can be subjective and still meaningful. We don't need a God to recognize that rape, murder, or child abuse are wrong, because we understand harm, suffering, and empathy directly as human beings. That's not a weakness in morality. It's how moral reasoning actually works. Research in evolutionary psychology shows that our sense of right and wrong developed to help humans cooperate and survive. Empathy, fairness, and reciprocity are traits seen not just in humans but in primates, elephants, even rats. These aren't divine instructions. They're natural, social instincts shaped over millions of years. Moral philosopher Philippa Foot showed that moral claims are grounded in human needs and natural facts, not commands from above. When we say something is wrong, we're pointing to real-world harm, not breaking a supernatural rule. Frank's claim that moral disagreement means morality must be objective misunderstands how moral systems develop. Disagreement doesn't mean there's no truth. It means we're still working to understand it, like any area of knowledge. Let's hear Frank Turek's response.
Well, no, I think it does, because it's much more obvious that, say, sexually abusing children is wrong than atheism's true.
Right.
So why would you say that atheism's true in order to avoid the obvious conclusion that sexually abusing children is wrong? You already know sexually abusing children is wrong. Now, if you want to use an evolutionary argument, the problem is that undercuts everything you think. Because if everything we think is the product of evolution, the product of the laws of physics or biology, or whatever it is, then why should we believe anything we think? Forget about morality for a second. Why should we even believe that atheism's true or that Christianity's true? If we're completely... I'm sorry, I'm suffering from jet lag here. If our thoughts are the result of some random evolutionary process, why should we believe anything we think is true?
Well, the first thing is that evolution isn't a random process. But that aside, it's
let me put it this way: it's either directed by an outside intelligence or it's not.
Sure. Okay. I'll give
if
you
it's
that.
not directed by an outside intelligence, then it's random.
Yes. So
if it's directed by intelligence, then perhaps God exists. If it's not directed by intelligence, why should we believe anything we think?
It's this idea. It's almost sort of existential. Why should we believe anything if there's no guidance? To me, it's like asking the question, like you said earlier, about how do we know that we even exist, or that the universe wasn't created last Thursday? For me, it's somewhat based on consensus. It doesn't prove it's true, but reason is one of those things that we need to assume in order to get anywhere. In the same sense, we need to assume that we exist in order to have a philosophical discussion.
No, that's a very wise point. I agree with you. The question is, how do we explain reason on a naturalistic worldview? Well,
reason and consciousness can be explained as coming about through evolution. The way in which we sense the world.
But let's stop there for just a second, though, Alex. If that's the case, why should we trust it?
Oh, well, we don't necessarily have to. Again, it's a subjective thing. But every single person...
But that would mean reason's subjective.
Yes, it is.
Well, if reason is subjective, then...
If reason's not subjective, then how do you and I come to different conclusions, both using reason?
Because we have free will. if reason's subjective, we couldn't even communicate. If there weren't these objective, unchanging laws of logic.
Well, yes, there are objective rules and tenets of reason, but reason itself is subjective in the same way that morality, you can say under certain assumptions, there are objective truths about morality. If you have a certain assumption about reason, then yes, there are objective tenets.
Well, that's what I mean. These immaterial laws of logic that aren't made of molecules, how do we explain those on a naturalistic worldview?
How do you mean? How do we explain?
Why are there laws of logic? Why are there laws of mathematics?
They're a product of consciousness. And laws of mathematics are not a thing in themselves, but rather a way to explain the universe. So the laws of mathematics would not exist without human beings, so they are subjective. But the things that they describe would.
Oh, no, hold on.
So when you talk about logic, when you talk about reason, these things aren't ends, they're means. They're means to understanding certain things. So we use reason to understand that the Earth goes around the sun.
Frank tries to argue that if our minds are the product of evolution, then we can't trust reason or moral beliefs. But this misunderstands how evolution works. Natural selection favors organisms that accurately perceive and respond to their environment, because those that don't, die. The fact that we can land spacecraft on other planets, predict disease patterns, and build the internet is strong evidence that our evolved brains are reliably processing information. Reason isn't some magical gift that requires a divine source. It's a tool, a cognitive strategy that evolved because it helped our species survive. Neuroscience confirms this. Our brains are built to detect patterns, solve problems, and simulate future outcomes. These abilities enhanced our fitness in the ancestral environment. As for logic and math, those aren't floating laws that exist outside time and space. They're descriptive systems we created to understand consistent patterns in nature. The Pythagorean theorem works not because it was written in the sky by a god, but because we observed relationships in geometry that are always true under certain conditions. Alex is right to say that these tools, reason, logic, math, are means, not ends. They help us model reality. We assume their usefulness because they work. No faith in the supernatural is required.
I like what Louise Antony said in her debate with William Lane Craig. Louise Antony's an atheist, but she admitted something about morality and atheism that I think is very insightful. Here's what she said. This is her quote. She said, "Any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves." And here she is as an atheist saying, I have this sense of moral obligation that is so strong that any argument you give me for atheism or moral subjectivism will be based on the weaker premises than just the sense that I have that objective moral values and obligations exist. So that was my question originally to you, Alex, is why would you deny the strongest belief that you have intuitively and adopt a weaker belief in atheism or agnosticism?
Well, I don't deny it, because I don't deny, like I say, as long as I do have certain assumptions, and I admit that there are assumptions, I can say that I have an objective sense that these things are wrong on the assumption that I'm aiming for human prosperity.
Right, but you already pointed out that Sam Harris is begging the question on that. That is his human flourishing. And that's a conflation of epistemology and ontology. And as you pointed out, rightfully so, and 18 years old, he's already figured this out, which I didn't know this is 18, that Sam Harris is confusing epistemology and ontology. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
But the problem with Sam Harris's argument is he's going in there trying to show that certain things are right or wrong based on science. What I'm trying to do is say why people experience things as right or wrong based on science, which can be done. So I can say the reason that I feel that this is right and wrong is because of this. What I can't say is that this is right or wrong because of this.
I mean, does this mean, is it a problem for you then, telling people what they ought to do? Because there's a sense in which, you know, if you see a society being racist or treating women unequally or whatever it might be.
Or Catholic priests abusing children like you do on your website, you say that's wrong?
For me, the problem has always been, for the atheist who denies objective morality, is what right do you have to tell someone else? Because they're just acting according to their subjective preferences.
Well, the subjective preferences, I find, in these cases, we often agree. So, for instance, if I meet a member of the Ku Klux Klan, we can find common ground in the sense that I might say, okay, so why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? Why? Until we get to the final point and they say, well, I think that it's because my worldview is better for humanity. And I say, well, hang on, so do I. I think my worldview is better for humanity. So let's go on the assumption that what we want is to get what's best for humanity. And here's how I think my worldview leads to that. So even people...
but if they say, but I don't believe black people are human, what do you say to that?
Well, that's the thing. Then the discussion doesn't become... Then the discussion becomes trying to prove how they are.
Right.
You sort of remove the need for a basis once you find out what the basis of their beliefs are. Once you find that common ground. For instance, me and you agree, you and I agree that, for instance, I assume that we would agree that human flourishing is a good thing.
Oh, sure.
But you would say that that's because you have that in you because of God. I say that I have that in me because of
evolution. It's not just because it's in me, but because there's an objective standard of goodness outside of ourselves.
Absolutely
and
fine.
so when you say that we can agree that we want to have a better society, as Justin pointed out earlier, you're implying a best. Because in order to say something's better or worse, you have to imply a best. Well, what is that best? What is the ontological grounding of that best?
Not necessarily. You don't have to have... this reminds me of one of Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways, the degrees of perfection. There doesn't need to be an absolute perfection to have an idea of something which is more perfect than something else. And to your reference of C.S. Lewis...
I think there would have to be a standard of perfection, or a standard that you're aiming for to say you're getting closer to that standard or further away, better or worse.
It's like your reference to C.S. Lewis. You can't know a crooked line without having some idea of straight. I don't think that's true. For instance, think of it this way.
Why is it not true?
It's not a case, if you're talking about good and evil, you don't need evil to know good. If you think about, say you have a flat plane.
You're absolutely right about that.
Think about you have a flat plane.
You don't need evil to know good, I agree with you.
So,
you need good to know evil, though.
I don't think so either. If you have a flat plane, you can see like a hill, like an indentation on that flat plane. Now, the rest of that plane is not a valley. You don't need the valley to understand the hill. You just need the hill in comparison to what is neutral. So you can have evil compared to what is neutral. You can have good compared to what is neutral. You don't need the two extremes.
What would be your definition of evil?
My definition of evil? Well, that's a very broad thing. But if you're asking me, again, subjectively, anything I would say that unwarrantedly elicits human suffering or animal suffering to an extent.
Okay,
as well.
so that would imply that it's the opposite of human flourishing. So it's very difficult to define evil without reference to good.
Not necessarily. It's not. It may be the opposite of human flourishing, but it's also just the absence of no suffering. Not necessarily good, but no evil. In the same sense, this is what frustrates me about atheists a lot, is they'll do the same thing but the opposite. They'll look at God and they'll think of the evil. They'll listen to Hitchens talk about some celestial North Korea and they'll recoil at that and they'll say, that's a horrible thing. I can't imagine that reality. But I'm sorry, just because you don't like a reality doesn't make it not real. And so if there are no objective morals, then unfortunately what Joseph Stalin did in the USSR was not objectively wrong. But that's not a shocking thing to say if we're under the assumption that nothing is objectively wrong.
Do you understand then why for many people the moral argument is so powerful?
Absolutely.
Because they cannot get themselves to a point of view where those kinds of acts are only really about people's preferences.
But I don't think that's what Frank is necessarily doing, because I think you're right that a lot of people do just recoil in horror at the idea of there being no objective standard, but I don't think that's what you're doing. I'd say that you're being cleverer than that. You're understanding that, yes, this is a bad idea, but more than that, you're saying that there's some way to prove that there is an objective reality, not just because you don't like it.
Yeah, I want to get beyond that, or maybe I should say underneath that, going back to Justin's point, and it's this. If you said this is all the result of evolution, you have to get outside the evolutionary process to believe that thought is true. Because if that thought is a result of the evolutionary process as well, why believe it?
Frank appeals to emotion when he says that without objective morality, we can't call things like Stalin's atrocities truly wrong. But this only proves that people feel moral convictions deeply. It doesn't prove they're grounded in something supernatural. Alex is right to point out that we can talk about better and worse actions based on their consequences, specifically how they affect well-being and reduce suffering. That's not arbitrary. It's measurable. If a society promotes human flourishing, reduces cruelty, and improves life for the most people, that's a clear moral improvement, even without invoking a divine standard. Philosophers like Derek Parfit and Peter Singer have shown that you don't need a god to get to universal ethics. You just need reason, empathy, and a commitment to consistency. Most people already agree on basic moral values because we're wired for empathy and shaped by social norms. And when we disagree, we use reason and evidence to argue for better outcomes, not scripture. Christianity doesn't own morality. In fact, some of the Bible's moral teachings, like support for slavery, genocide, and patriarchy, are now considered deeply wrong because our understanding of morality has evolved. So Alex is right. Morality is not about divine rules. It's about how we treat each other in the real world. What do you think makes a society truly moral? Dogma or compassion? If you found this valuable, like the video, subscribe, and join us for more honest conversations that put reason first.